Hello everybody, welcome to the I Am IT Geek YouTube channel. My name is Shabaz, and as ever I am the IT Geek. Welcome to another episode of the SC300 YouTube series that we've got around the exam prep. Now you might notice today I'm not Dwayne's normally on with me due to some scheduling conflicts, mainly me, unfortunately. Not mainly me, all me. We've not been able to record together, but we are still going to be doing the next few episodes together. It's just that Dwayne has recorded the demos and the lab sort of stuff separately. But you will see them after each episode. But just this theory part, I'm going to be on my own. It's only for a few episodes. Again, just as you can imagine, we're other sides of the world, time obviously differences as well, and different families. So it's obviously very difficult sometimes to schedule these sort of things. But we're making the best of it. This episode we are now well into module two, and we're looking at managing user authentication still, and this is part three of that little mini series. So let's get started with the theory. So yep, as normally Dwayne is here with me, so I'd have a bit of back and forth with Dwayne, but he's not here for now, so he will be at the end of this episode though. But this is still on module two, as I mentioned, which is the implementing an authentication and access management solution. So in this episode, we are on part three of managing user authentication. So specifically, we're going to be looking at implementing certificate-based authentication in Azure AD. And then we're going to move on to configuring Azure AD user authentication for Windows and Linux VMs in Azure. And then I'll move on to introducing Dwayne, and Dwayne's going to cover the demo, which is configuring Azure AD sign-in for Windows VMs. So let's get started looking at implementing certificate-based authentication in Azure AD. I'm going to do like a diagram and show you and explain the implementing Kerbero and certificate-based authentication through a diagram. So here we have Azure AD, and this is obviously our Azure tenancy. And here we have a DMZ, and that segregates the Azure AD and the on-premises solution. There we have two sort of services, like a SharePoint server and a kind of another server with an Azure AD connector. In the middle there, back in Azure, we have the Azure AD proxy and the authentication as well. So at the other side of the DMZ, so between Azure and on-premises, we have an Azure AD app proxy connector, and that proxy connector is installed on that member server. Okay, we have our user here. Okay, he's our user, managing his own business. And what happens is the user enters the URL to access the on-premises application through the application proxy. Okay, so they're given a URL when you configure the certificate-based authentication, and they use that to access the application. So that's step one. Step two shows that the application proxy redirects that request to Azure AD authentication services to do this is the pre-authentication essentially. At this point, Azure AD applies an applicable authentication and authorization policies, such as MFA, for example. That's quite a common one. If the user is validated, Azure AD creates a token and sends it to the user. So that's why we've got the back and forth arrow there in the diagram. Okay. So if we look at step three in this process, here the user passes a token to the application proxy. Okay, so now we're moving on towards like the right of the diagram now, as you can see in step three. We've got the certificate there, and that token, it's passed it on to application proxy. So then step four is the application proxy validates the token and retrieves the user principal name, so that's the UPN from it. And then the connector pulls the UPN and the service principal name, so that's the SPN, through a duly authenticated secure channel. And it's doing that, you can see it's going through our DMZ, okay, so that's protected. Let's look at step three now. Five, should I say, we've already done step three. Step five, going backwards, move forwards. The connector performs Kerbero constrained delegation, or short version KTD. And that's a negotiation with the on-premises AD, as we can see there, okay? And this is impersonating the user to get Kerbero token to the application. Okay, so that's that step five. It's from the Azure AD proxy connector to the Active Directory server. Okay, then move forward to step six. Again, that's on the Azure AD server, or the Active Directory server, sorry. Active Directory sends a Kerbero token for the application back to the connector. Okay, so again, It's connected in step 5. The app proxy has impersonating user to get a Kerberos token. In step 6, AD is giving that Kerberos token back to the Azure AD app proxy connector. Okay, so then looking at step 7, this is a connector then sends that original request to the application server using that Kerberos token it received from AD. Okay, so now we're having that interaction with that application server, which is what we're trying to access, or which the user is trying to access, should I say. So that's step 7. And the final step, which is step 8, we see here. The application sends a response to the connector, which is then returned to the application proxy service, and finally to the user. So that's kind of the sort of 8-step process of the certificate-based authentication using Azure AD, trying to access an on-premises application. So let's move on now, look at some pre-deployment requirements. I guess this is what we need to have in place before we do the deployment. We need to ensure our apps are all integrated with Windows Authentication. So a lot of apps like SharePoint web apps, they are set to use integrated with Windows Authentication. So we need to make sure that's in place before we do any deployment. All our apps have service principal names. We need to make sure that they all have, because again, as you saw in the previous image where we were going through the walkthrough, that is one of the things that is requested. So we need to make sure the apps all have an SPN. That's very important. So the server that's running the connector and the server running the app both need to be domain joined. Okay, so again, the other side of that DMZ, if you remember the diagram that we went through, and they both need to be domain joined. They can't be just, work group servers. Final sort of pre-deployment requirement is that token group global and universal access. So the server running that connector has access to and it has to be access to read that token group global and universal attribute. It's like an attribute for users. Okay, so the server running that connector needs that read access to that attribute, and that attribute is called token groups global and universal. Okay, so those are some pre-deployment requirements. So let's now move on to looking at configuring Azure AD User Authentication for Windows and Linux VMs in Azure. And this is something that's going to be covered by Dwayne in the sort of lab demo later on. So with user authentication for VMs, it does increase security on your virtual machines, and it uses that Azure AD integration to do that. We all know Azure AD comes with a lot of security increases, especially with those premium licensing, you can get a lot of added value from a security perspective. So obviously, in turn, if you're using that for access to virtual machines, be it Linux or Windows, it's just going to increase that security posture there as well. So you can utilize all those good features for security features for Azure AD with your server logins essentially. It's got authentication platform support for multiple virtual machine sort of operating systems. So the Windows Server 2019 data center and above. So that's 2022. Obviously doesn't support 2016. It also supports Windows 10 1809 and later, so quite a few, the newer operating systems in Windows 10. Obviously Windows 11, which is the sort of latest Windows family user operating system, and obviously it has to support Linux VMs because it's in the title of the title of the slide. So yeah, so it needs to be it does support Linux VMs as well. So I'll talk about some of the actual specific benefits about using Azure AD for user authentication of virtual machines. As I said, it uses those Azure AD credentials, and again, it means one less credential, one just password for you to remember because it's using your same sort of login. You can use it for more services, and one of those is authenticating to VMs. So rather than having a different domain password or a different workgroup password and credential, you can use those Azure AD credentials. Okay, so quite a big benefit there. It's minimal reliance on your local admin accounts as well. So again, if you remember back in the especially for servers, you'd have a local admin as well as your domain admin. With this sort of user authentication with Azure AD, you don't need to have local admin accounts. So it's less reliance on those. You can use your Azure AD accounts, and if you need access, you can use which I'm sure we'll be looking at later on, PIM, which is privileged identity management. You can use sort of the just-in-time access to elevate people's permissions. So again, big positive and benefit to having the Azure AD user authentication integration there. Azure AD control and password settings as well. You can utilize all those good security features that we talked about for within Azure AD, and one of those being the Azure AD control password settings. You can use all those to help managing your authentication to the VMs. So again, another really good benefit to using Azure AD user authentication. Final one is that integration with MFA required for conditional access. Again, you can configure that same conditional access policy for MFA to require MFA when you're authenticating to virtual machines, be it Linux or Windows. So again, it just increases that security posture when you're accessing or authenticating to virtual machines as well. So yeah, for those living in the UK, you know how hot it is at the moment. So I'm very hot. I need to have a rest. So I'm going to hand over to Dwayne to do the demo. Over to you, Dwayne.
Thanks, Shabaz. Let's get into the Azure portal and show how to configure a Windows VM for Azure Active Directory sign-in. So we're going to go up here and we're going to go into our virtual machines. You can find virtual machines also in the search bar, but I have those nice and easily right in my recents. I'm going to create a new virtual machine here. And I'm going to put it in a resource group. And we're going to give it a name. MOVM2. My scrolling is going a little wacky here this morning. We still need to, even though we're going to use our Azure AD credentials, we still need to create a administrator account for this virtual machine. So we're going to do that. And we're going to allow port 3389 for RDP, and we're going to leave that the same. We've got our networking in here. We'll leave that as default. And in here I think it's in management, we have here under identity, we can now say log in with Azure Active Directory credentials. And you notice it actually created the system assigned managed identity was checked when we did that to allow that to take place. You need to have either a virtual machine administrator log on or virtual machine user log on role-based access control role within the virtual machine or the resource group or the subscription identity and access management in Azure. So keep that in mind. You can go out and learn more about that. And then we're just going to skip the rest here and just go review and create. Hopefully I have everything correctly done in here and pass my validation. And I have, so I'll create my virtual machine. So if you, and we'll show the role here in a second, while that's deploying, let that start deploying and get me to my deployment. And if I go back here to home, I'm going to go into my resource group here and go to the AZ900 resource group that I created. I'm going to go to access control here and go to role assignments. And if I go to role assignments and I search, oh, actually roles, sorry, go to roles and search virtual machine, you'll see there's a bunch of roles for virtual machine in here. If I scroll down here, we have our local user login or our user login. We're going to select the user login. We've got the administrator login in there as well. Actually, we're going to do the administrator login because we want to allow administrator access for this user. We're going to add this role, add a role assignment. And actually go back here. Let's find it again. Assign this role. And going to assign it to a group, and we're going to assign it to my admin accounts. And select. Review and assign. and now that role has been assigned. So we've assigned that role. We've created a virtual machine that has Azure Active Directory login credentials. So now any of our administrators, and if we go back to our Azure Active Directory here and go to our groups, I have a dynamic group that I created in one of the previous videos for admin accounts, and look at the members of this account. You can see who our admins are. And I'm going, okay, and my deployment is complete. If I go back, I'm going to go back to my user account here a second, just to make it easy. Yeah, I'm going to edit my user account here and edit the properties of my user account. And I'm going to make this user an admin. I think that's what my group was. Hasn't added me yet. All right. Okay, so let's give this a try because my user's not in here yet, but let's try to log into that virtual machine with one of these accounts. Just have to remember what my password is. So hold on one second here. Let's go to my virtual machines again. Go to demo VM 2. And I'm going to copy my IP address, and I'm going to come in here and put it in here. And I'm going to try and connect. So hold on one second here while I try to figure out my user accounts here. Oops. And so let's try. More choices here. Use a different account and use this account because I believe I just created this one, so I think I know what my password is. Nope, that wasn't it. All right, let's try a different one. No, these aren't. I do not know my passwords right now. So, but anyway, this group of users is set up to log into that virtual machine now with our Azure AD credentials. So you can now RDP into that account and that virtual machine using Azure Active Directory credentials. Why would we want to do that? Giving everybody the administrative account doesn't allow us a level of security and a level of auditability to who is accessing that account. If we're using our Azure Active Directory credentials, we can now see who's logging in and RDPing into and logging in using login credentials and logging into those virtual machines through our login activity. So much more secure, much more of a trail of custodianship within who is accessing our accounts. So that ends our demo of how to set up Azure Active Directory login for virtual machines. Back to you, Shabaz.
Thanks, Dwayne, for that amazing demo and lab on authenticating virtual machines of Azure AD. So again, that is the end of this episode, and that finishes the sort of topic as well. the sort of user authentication. So we're kind of halfway into, say about halfway into module 2 right now. So now we've done the sort of the managing user authentication bit. We're next going to be moving on to looking at conditional access. So we've got a 3-part sort of little mini series, and then we've got the final part of module 2, which is Azure AD identity protection. So that'll bring us towards the end of module 2. And then we've got a smaller module for module 3, which we'll be working on the week after. So again, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you for your continued support. Please continue to like and subscribe to the channel. Any comments that any questions that you might have, we are very, very grateful. Mine and Dwayne's socials are all in the description, as well as, again, most important thing, Dwayne, the link to Dwayne's book on the SC300 exam prep by Pact. Please, buy that and follow it along while you're doing these. We've also got the link to the GitHub labs as well for the SC300. Follow those along as well as Dwayne's doing the labs and demos. So thank you everybody for watching, and up until next time, thank you and goodbye.